Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Monteveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about 7 politically incorrect truths from the Stoics. It's a recent article I wrote on the Stoa letter. You can find that on Substack. And we thought it'd be fun to talk through, or at least I thought it would be fun. I'll speak for you, Michael, to talk through these 7 and go into more depth with them and develop our thinking. But essentially, I was thinking of, what are some Stoic claims that sort of cut against modern politics and culture, broadly speaking. And, Stoicism is a life philosophy, of course. It's principally about how to live well, and that by necessity involves some amount of, if not conflict, certain claims being made that might cut against contemporary culture, contemporary views, of course, of what a good life consists in. So I thought of 7. We'll go through each. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I am excited. I mean, I agree with you. It takes a position, and whenever you take a position, Stoicism isn't really adding any insight if it doesn't tell you what you're doing is wrong, or doesn't say what the average person or what is typical part of our culture is wrong. If it doesn't call out anything about that, then it's not really adjusting your behavior. So it has to be committed to be transformative. It has to be committed to different positions. Some of those are more controversial than others. We'll go through some of the controversial ones today. And the Stoics also have this tradition of, I think it's a rhetorical device, like reveling in being controversial. There's the Stoic paradoxes by Cicero. But I even feel like a lot of the ways the Stoics would phrase their arguments would be intentionally extreme or controversial. And so I see you following in that tradition, Caleb, that this is a modern Stoic paradoxes and fits right in.
Perfect. Well, our first truth and our first Stoic claim is the idea that, just jumping right into it, if politics makes you unhappy, that's a you problem. That's one way to put it. I think the central, more precise claim, which follows from Stoic ethics, the Stoic vision of life, is that politics cannot make you unhappy or happy, which in a way I think really does cut against the ordinary way a lot of us interact with, whether it's the news or political discussions. People naturally think that political turmoil, injustice of different kinds threaten our pursuit of happiness. They threaten the picture of the good life. And I think the radical Stoic idea that externals cannot impinge on your happiness has the obvious upshot that political externals cannot threaten your happiness either. And I do think this cuts against certainly a lot of political rhetoric of people making claims about perhaps them being owed something by the state because, not having sufficient, say, material wealth or what have you prevents them from pursuing happiness, or others making the claim that certain forms of injustice threaten theirs or others' pursuit of the good life. So, and the Stoics just deny that. That's a philosophy that's ultimately focused on, the internal. That's what makes a good life or not. So, what's your take on that, Michael?
Yeah, I agree with it. I would add 2 nuances, or one nuance. You said, the Stoics say externals can't make you unhappy or they can't threaten your happiness. The Stoic position is they can't make you unhappy without your participation. They can't threaten your happiness without you, making a mistake as well. And so, yeah, politics can make you angry. Politics can make you unhappy. But that's what I see the thrust is your point. And I mean, you wrote it, so correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a you problem because you're participating in that anger. You're participating in that. You're letting it affect you, basically. or you're letting it disrupt you. And so there's no necessity of that. That's a participate. You're participating in that. You're making a mistake. You're judging the situation incorrectly. I think that's part one. So yeah, and agree with what you say, but just making that nuance of lots of people are unhappy being online or being in kind of addicted to news in a way that um, riles them up, frustrates them, makes them chronically anxious. But the Stoic position is just like that is a character fault. That is something. It is not the fact that the world is broken is why you are anxious and angry. It is because you have an unhealthy relationship with politics and with the news.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second piece I would add there is that, because the really common counter argument is always, well, what am I supposed to do then? I'm supposed to just do nothing. And that's why I think this is well written. It's not politics. If politics motivates you, if politics incites action from you, that's a you problem. If politics makes you do some sort of coordinated effort to improve the circumstances of others, that's a you problem. That's not the commitment here. It's that if politics makes you unhappy, that's a you problem. And I think that's a much more defensible position for the reasons we just stated. It's not about passivity. It's that you say, well, I can't be happy if Trump is president, or I can't be happy if this kind of policy gets enacted. Anything like this is just, I mean, that's just antithetical to Stoicism, right? It's like that is having no sort of constraint on your happiness. It's your way of thinking about it and relating to those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I think if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that the Stoics are not promoters of political passivity. If you're newer to Stoicism, I think that's an essential point. Of course, that's not what we're saying. And in a way, that's almost Stoicism is a demanding philosophy. Once you're called to, be stoic in the face of political turmoil, but equally, you might be called to make serious sacrifices in order to promote justice. At the same time that you develop an inner citadel, part of being a Stoic is acting in a just manner, and that might require serious political engagement, of course. So I think that is of course a central point that we need to make. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, just we need to make it every time. But it's important, and it's an important distinction. It's not politics can and should motivate you. You have responsibility to other people in your community, your neighborhood, your country, humanity. But any sort of claim or way of thinking of just I'm just anxious because of this thing, I'm unhappy because of this political situation. It's a reminder. Stoicism always puts that onus, that responsibility back on you. No, you're unhappy because of yourself.
Yeah, it takes two to play.
Yeah, and some situations might require more advanced Stoicism to be happy in than others. But at the end of the day, you put that responsibility back on yourself.
Yeah, I suppose also another way to develop this point, perhaps going deeper into it, is that so the Stoics, I think it's important to promote justice, and how we think about the world, of course, is going to influence the degrees to which we are just or not, because that influences our actions. And I also think how we speak is often, of course, an expression of how we think, and perhaps sometimes things go the other way as well. The way we speak influences how we think, which is just a long way of saying perhaps the Stoic will talk differently about many political matters than is common. So instead of making these sort of arguments that justify political positions, votes, what have you, that are grounded in something being a threat to the good life or something being required for the pursuit of happiness, they might ground them in instead ideas of kinship or fairness, some of these other components of virtue and justice in particular that we've discussed, as opposed to some other visions of the good.
Just to put an example, so if I say like trying to think of it. I mean, it might be a bad example or controversial example, but you try to talk about some sort of like welfare program or lunches for kids in schools, and the Stoic isn't going to make some sort of claim about, well, it's impossible for someone to be happy when they're poorly fed, and so we have this obligation, or it's unhappy for someone in poverty to live a good life, so we have this obligation to pull people out of poverty. It's going to be some sort of claim instead about, if we have the money to be able to afford to do this, and we have some a kinship or connection with people within our own country, we have a responsibility to do that. It's going to be something like that. It's going to be an appeal to justice, not an appeal to people's fragility. Is that right? Is that where you're going?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a good example from the left, perhaps, where sometimes people might assume, or in fact do argue, that people need a certain living standard in order to live well. And I mean, there's some level with that's true, but in developed countries, I think Stoics would say nearly every person meets that living standard to live well, so long as their life is not being threatened. So they wouldn't. I think exactly that they wouldn't ground the case in material goods being required for the pursuit of happiness, but rather instead of ideas like fairness, or your fellowship with other citizens, and so on. And perhaps a case from the right, or at least positions that are commonly associated with the right, is sometimes people will talk about immigration sort of radically changing the nature of the country, your city, your neighborhood, and that sort of being an obstacle to living well. This used to be my city, but now newer generations or people have moved in with alien cultures have ruined it, and because they've ruined the city, I'm unable to live in the way I want to. And I think the Stoics would stop, especially at that last line, unable to live in the way that you want to. No, that's not, immigrants don't have that power over you. Whether or not you get the welfare check doesn't have that power over you. And I think that's probably where the line has some amount of bite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're just on point 1 of 7, so we might have to move on, but I guess there was an additional nuance there. When you hear if politics makes you unhappy, I think news, podcasts, memes on Instagram, they get you kind of riled up. But then you have this other point about, if there's some sort of political policy and you think, my life hinges on this political policy, or like I'm really angry because I don't have the capacity to live well with this change. The Stoics are going to say that change doesn't have the power over you to take away your capacity for happiness. And it's a two-sided claim, right? Because it's a really nice claim if you're down on your luck and you want to feel empowered. Hey, you're feeling really down, things are bad, but know that you can make a good life for yourself. That's a very empowering claim. Mm-hmm. But when you're wanting to feel validated for your anger, or you're wanting people to agree with you, it's a very painful claim. Like, I'm really angry about this. Well, doesn't really have the ability to ruin your life. Seems like you're doing that to yourself by being so angry about it. That is a very, it hurts, kind of slaps when it comes there, but you can't have one without the other, right? They're the same. Just depends on if you were looking for the medicine at the time or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's only, I think that connects to this point about anger, especially the second truth for the Stoics, which is that anger is never appropriate. And that's just something we've discussed before. We'll link to some episodes where we go into this in more depth. But this is just this is a canonical Stoic position. It's a hard line against anger. And it's this view that, even in a world full of corruption, incompetence, injustice, what have you, revenge is not justified. Anger is not a valid state. It's a negative passion. And of course there is always that point that perhaps some form of, again, it's a similar point to the point about politics, I suppose. There's this idea that sometimes arguments for punishment or retribution of some sort can perhaps be made by Stoics, but they're not going to be grounded in this idea that, someone has harmed you, therefore they deserve to suffer in order to make up for the serious harm that they've done to me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. We've talked about this before. The thing that really grounds it for me is this almost like practical argument where anger is like self-defeating. Like if you're angry, it's because you want some sort of change to the world, but being angry actually makes you less effective at bringing out that change, makes you less less intelligent, less able to like respond to changes in circumstances effectively and accurately. I think about this in sport. You just never encourage an athlete to get angry because it's just not an effective way to execute skill. It feels very motivating, but in practice, it's pretty ineffectual. And then I was almost thinking about it like I don't know if this is too of an online example, but there's that meme with the bell curve where it's like the person at the bottom of the bell curve thinks one thing and the person in the middle thinks, position two, but then the person at the top of the bell curve thinks position one again. And I almost think that the reason people object to this Stoic position is that there's almost two reasons you can be without anger. You can be without anger because you're non-Stoic and don't care. And in that case, yeah, it's like, oh, somebody just insulted your brother, your sister, and you're not angry. That's kind of weird. It's kind of a weird position for a non-Stoic to take. I almost agree that for somebody who's progressing and hasn't developed the Stoic skills yet, it's almost like better to be a person that's angry and is like connected to or interested in these ideas of justice or improving the world. It's almost like better to be that than somebody who's not Stoic, but like doesn't care about injustice or doesn't care about improving the world or doesn't care about honor or any of these things. But then the end result, like the Stoic position, you end up without anger, but you're without anger for a different reason, which is that you realize that it's not appropriate. You realize that it's not effective. Was that making sense? It's like, I think it feels inappropriate to people because they assume you're that first person, that non-Stoic who just doesn't care about the thing. But if you are not angry for a Stoic reason, it's the same kind of response for a totally different reason. Yeah. What do you think about that?
No, I think that certainly does make sense. So another way to think about it is probabilistically, I suppose, where if you take, the set of people who are not angry about an injustice, most of them don't care about it. Whereas the people who are angry about that justice, they do that injustice, they do care about it. So anger is then evidence of
Yeah.
caring about, and in this case, injustice, something one should care about. And I think people think the same in personal relationships. You didn't care that, this bully hurt me. That means you don't care about me at all. So I do think there's an important upshot for Stoics, which is that you need to show that you care by other means. You can't rely on these common social heuristics we have about anger or displays of anger, or take sort of the Epictetus type strategy. Don't maybe groan outwardly but not inwardly, I think is the other approach here. But
yeah, Seneca uses the example of like screaming at children just because they like respond to angry adults, but not actually being angry, like just like, but scolding them in the way they're used to teachers scolding them.
Yeah, exactly that. Which, I think that's a useful example for the concept.
Yeah, so anger is never appropriate, but you can still scream at children in the right context. we're still leaving that.
Yeah. And I think it does obviously does bring up the failure mode of, I mean, sometimes it's obviously inappropriate to be angry outwardly and inwardly to people. So it's not always it's both that matter. All right. Next one. Neither victimhood nor victory are moral credentials. So I think in a lot of political, social rhetoric, there's this idea of either putting victors sort of in a special place. You've got the successful athlete, the wealthy entrepreneur, the beautiful person, what have you, and many cultures, discussion or such will implicitly grant a kind of moral credential to that person. Because you're rich, you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps or something of this sort that says something good about your character. Alternatively, other cultures might say the reverse. Because you're poor, a minority, or on the middle class, whatever it is, because in some sense you're a victim, you get a different kind of moral credential. Perhaps, I think a common example of many politicians will speak as if the middle class had some ability to come up with political insight that other classes do not, or something of this sort, in a way that at least implicitly it seems to assume that they have a kind of moral standing that perhaps other classes do not. Whereas I think the Stoics think this isn't so. It could be the case that some of these different classes do have insights that others don't, but certainly none of them have any kind of intrinsic moral advantage, whether victor or victim. And I do think rhetorically these sort of appeals to either should have limited power. So yeah, what do you think about that?
I mean, I love this one. I think this one's really important. Two things I would say about it. Just agreed with what you said. One thing Epictetus would say is um, look at the kinds of things you associate with goodness or you think about goodness, and it will tell you what you value. So, if you find yourself like being like, man, these beautiful, strong young athletes are great, it tells you something about what you value. You value these external things because you're making kind of a category mistake. You're associating these people with good, like you're lumping all the good things in together. Same thing with victimhood. If it will, you're lumping in things that don't necessarily correspond with each other together. And so that part of that Stoic goal is to pull them apart and say, yeah, you can have had a rough upbringing and be insightful, or you can have a rough upbringing and just be like a terrible person. And same thing with a good athlete. And practically, I see this a lot in jiu-jitsu. You see this a lot in people who have achieved power, who are able to like exploit that power. Like somebody assumes a black belt in jiu-jitsu is like some sort of moral authority or some sort of life coach, or even just generally a good person because they've obtained expertise in one domain. And then, as you said, the flip side of that is somebody who, they grew up poor or they had some terrible life circumstances, and now we need to privilege their perspective over other people. I think about this in terms of Kwame Appiah wrote about lived experience, and he was talking about how we should the point of valuing lived experience is to just treat it as a source of evidence, but not treat it as a trump card. And I feel like sometimes we do that in terms of victimhood. Is we previously we just didn't listen to people that didn't have power or weren't traditionally educated or weren't able to communicate in the traditional forums, and we've almost shifted so far that it becomes this like enlightened form of knowledge or expertise that other forms have to defer to, which doesn't necessarily make sense to me when you're answering complicated questions about politics or policy or things that go outside of those domains. I mean, all that's just a long-winded, that was just some examples of where I see it, both in valuing people that are have victories and valuing people that are victims. But the Stoic line is just going to be you're clumping things that don't belong together. Mm-hmm. You think being strong is good, so you think strong people are good people and being strong is not good. So you shouldn't mix other types of goodness with that judgment. You're making, conceptual overlap that's not helpful.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And the case of thinking about these results, thinking about victimhood or success as perhaps giving unique forms of evidence is useful without granting a trump card. Perhaps perhaps people who are educated do in fact have more knowledge than those who aren't about specific things they've been educated about or encountered in their life. But of course, obviously, the reverse might be true as well.
Well, it
And
will just be a
no
case
matter,
by case basis, and
yeah,
so you just don't make you don't bias either way. Yeah, just on a case by case basis, and I think it's that trump card feature that I wanted. You consider the evidence, and the same way you don't discard the evidence because the person is either a victim or a victor, but you don't give a trump card either way either.
mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Next one. You don't get to choose all of your roles. In some ways, this is a common sense idea, but I do think there are some strands, especially in Western culture, that are so individualist that they might disagree with this. So I do the Stoics. The common view of the Stoics is that you have a number of different roles. Fundamentally, you are a human being, a rational animal, and then you have roles depending on your social situation, your personality, and not all of these roles that they think are important to fulfill are ones that you've chosen. Epictetus has a line from Discourses 3.2 where he says, it's essential that I preserve my relationships, the natural and acquired ones, as a pious man, son, brother, father, and citizen. So not all of those roles are chosen, but the Stoics think it's essential to fulfill them well, be excellent in them nonetheless. And I think there certainly is a strand of thinking that's more individualist. This idea that you don't need to perform well in a relationship unless it's one you voluntarily reflected on and chosen. You didn't choose to be brought into the world. You didn't choose to belong to this city, nation, what have you. You didn't choose these loyalties. Therefore, you don't have any responsibility or obligation or calling with respect to any of them unless you decide you do. The Stoics, I think the Stoics just straightforwardly just don't agree with that. They think, look, you can have a role, obligation, responsibility, calling, even if you didn't decide to take it up as some sort of voluntary, independent being.
Yeah, I agree with what the Stoics say. I think this is, as you said at the start, um, seems common sense, but actually pretty controversial if you try to put it into practice. And I think of an example with family, because I mean the roles that you don't choose, it's the ones about being a human, like the basic moral responsibility of being a human, and then it's your family, your relationships. Um, you don't choose your brothers and sisters or your parents, but you do choose your romantic partners, for example. But um, that idea that you have an obligation to family, regardless of how they've treated you, can feel kind of stifling or unjust. I do think there is that stream in modern culture of, this needs to be reciprocal or this needs to be even. Otherwise, I'm being exploited. I'm being taken
Mm-hmm.
advantage of. I'm being abused. Um, and all those things can be true. They would say that just doesn't erase the fact of the matter about the family relationship and the fact of the matter that brings certain obligations. And maybe that obligation is just, this is not to say the Stoic thinks you need to invite, uh, I'll keep on the terrible family member example. The Stoics aren't saying, you need to invite your terrible family members over and you need to give them a place in your house to live rent free, and you got to put up with them if they're, being mean to your kids or something like this. But maybe that just means that you don't do anything, like um, don't punish them or kick them out of your life in a way you would a stranger. Like there's just kind of a higher bar, or maybe, they insult you and you don't insult them back. You just are more stoic about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kind of a higher bar of relationship. Um, yeah, it's a fuzzy one. But I agree with you. The Stoics would say that there's certain facts of the matter. Those facts carry responsibilities, and you need to figure out how to carry out those responsibilities effectively. You don't just get to cut somebody out because you don't like them.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. I like this statement from Brian W.V. Norton. He's a philosopher, and it's about the Confucians, actually. And I think this is a common view in other philosophical schools, but he summarizes their view in contrast to perhaps a more Western autonomous idea that we're born free. He says, we're not born free. We are born with obligations to parents and other relatives who will raise us to adulthood, to teachers who shape us far beyond what is required to just earn a paycheck, and to the pre-existing civilization that makes all our individual contributions possible. And I think that has this passage in particular makes me think of one reason why the Stoics think these roles are important is because you are part of a larger system, right? You're part of your family, of course, but also your city, a school, and ultimately a civilization. And those sorts of things matter. I think they have again, you have some responsibility, obligation, perhaps calling with respect to each of them.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going back in my mind to that meme of the beginner, intermediate, advanced person.
The midwit meme.
The midwit meme. And the beginner follows relationships because of social norms and because, like, non-reflectively. That's what I was told to do. That's what society pressured me to do. Then you advance a little bit and you start to question those norms. You start to seek truth. You maybe reject it a bit. You abandon some convention. And then the Stoic position is then you then say, hey, well, these conventions were grounded in kind of truths about the world. Maybe they get distorted. Maybe they don't. They're not right in how people always put them into practice. But there was some truth behind this, and I'm going to now consent into or actively participate in these roles. Treat my family a certain way. Pay a certain respect to elders or teachers, because I recognize that this is kind of like a natural fact about the world. I almost think this is like a very conservative strain of Stoicism. This idea that, there's these immutable facts about the world, and a lot of society is responding to them and sometimes getting them a bit wrong. Like health is good. Health is a preferred indifferent. Wealth is a preferred indifferent. People are kind of getting them wrong and exaggerating them. And so if you gain some philosophical maturity and you return to them, you'll see the truth in convention, but you'll come at it with a more kind of philosophical Stoic bent.
Yeah. I do think, this is plausibly one of the more, so to say, right-wing Stoic views. But again, it's a traditional view, not unique to the Stoics at all. And it's perhaps the more, I do think is the position that rejects this view that's more historically anomalous and perhaps more radical. In a way, this is the Stoics being somewhat conventional.
Yeah, it's only controversial in response to like a last 100 years of time rejection of these social rules and inherent connections to family and things like this.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Next idea. This is not something that Stoics explicitly said or could have said, but it's the idea that nearly everyone today lives in luxury. It just simply follows from the fact, these Epictetus, Musonius Rufus, scolding, heckling their rich Roman aristocratic students for living in decadent luxury, for having access to immense material wealth. when, hundreds of years later, we've had immense material progress, and all of us have access to things. I should say, all of us in developed countries have access to goods that even aristocratic Romans couldn't dream of. And our general living standard is exceptionally high, even for, doing really basic things like keeping the lights on throughout one's house, throughout one's day, access to food, sanitary, of course, matters are an order of magnitude better managed. So I think that's something to keep in mind when one's reading the Stoics, when they are, especially when they're bothering their students for being living in luxuries. That even if you're not at the top of the totem pole for as far as material success goes in your life, you might still be up there, historically speaking. You probably are, in fact, in a similar position to the students that Epictetus and Musonius Rufus were giving such a hard time for living in a decadent fashion.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way before. We like to make fun of the rich Roman kids, but yeah, pointing the finger back at us. Yeah, absolutely agree on this one. Again, it's just basing things not maybe in relative terms, but just in objective terms. Um, Objectively, we're incredibly well off, even people in relatively poor positions. I would like to say, like, if you're listening to this podcast, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but you're probably, that nearly, I really want to limit it to just like a select few of people in kind of abject poverty and really terrible conditions. Otherwise, we're doing quite well. And I also think about this in terms of access to philosophy. Like, also, if you're listening to this podcast, or Caleb, what you and I are doing, the people that would have the reason everybody's rich that you're reading about in philosophy is just the free time to do non-productive work that somebody in a kind of working class, let alone a slave, would just not have. But today we have the freedom. I can go and download an audiobook and I can like listen to Homer on the way to go to the grocery store and buy all these exotic fruits other people would have never seen before. And I can just be like, I can just listening to the Odyssey while I'm walking around my street. And so the access to even this world of ideas, because I sometimes think about, I don't want to take things too much off topic, but I sometimes think about this criticism of Stoicism the same way you might criticize religion, because religion goes, well, anybody can be saved, or at least Christianity or some version of Christianity. Anybody can be saved as long as they accept Jesus into their heart. And they say, well, what about the remote indigenous people that never heard about Jesus? Like, what about them? And then Stoicism says anybody can be happy as long as they like internalize these correct Stoic values. And it's like, well, what about the person who's never heard about Stoicism, who can't read, who never got any chance to engage with that? And we have that opportunity, or at least most people in Western society, or have this ability to engage with philosophy in a way people just couldn't before.
Yep, I do like that point, focusing on sort of the intellectual wealth we have access to, in some ways perhaps more important than the material wealth we have access to. So I think that's a good addition. Cool. We've got two more, and not too much time. We can always work on time management. We're still learning after all these years.
We spent too long on the first one every time.
Yeah, we did. So the next item, some lives are better than others. This is just follows, of course, from the Stoics having an opinionated view on a philosophy of life, what it is to live well. Of course, some lives involve living well, others do not. I think this is a clear upshot of Stoic philosophy. At the same time, it's worth saying that the Stoics were often cautious about making judgments in individual cases. saying that so and so is uniquely a bad person. But that I think that being said, they still make judgments about actions. Certainly, they make judgments about actions being not virtuous, particular thought patterns not being healthy, and sort of the fundamental sense of human flourishing, as well as perhaps certain behavioral patterns not being conducive for living a good life.
Yeah, no, I agree. The This is another one that falls in that category of something that would not be controversial 100 years ago is maybe controversial now. Um, I think there's this strain of thought now about we can't be judgmental of other people, or you need to understand their circumstances or their story, or people kind of value pluralism. Like there's different ways to live, and each way is good in its own regard. And it's just a kind of value realism. Like there's some good ways to be and some bad ways to be. And if you are a bad person, you have a bad life. And if you're a good person, you have a good life. And that means that some people's lives are better than others. And it's just like, if this is not true, what's the point of philosophy, right? Um, because the point of philosophy is to live well, which means that to live better than at least you could have lived, at least a different version of your own life, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the consistency that gets Stoics, others into trouble here, is that they're consistently judgmental about behaviors, actions, thoughts. I think everyone believes, someone who pursues wealth out of a greedy motive, that's not a good thing to do. That's a indication of a bad life. But at some point, maybe there are some cases where they won't make judgments about, in a way that Stoics are always making. They think there's a better decision when it comes to even rather ordinary matters concerning anything from diet to, Musonius Rufus talks about, of course, consumption, the sorts of things one has in one's house, to more weighty matters concerning justice, courage, and self-control. So the Stoics are certainly have views on what one ought to do, and that involves some amount of comparison.
Yeah, which is good. You don't need to necessarily agree. You can philosophically engage, but you have to kind of enter the question of philosophy with a view that some lives are better than others. Otherwise, like I said, otherwise, what's the point? So I just think it's a good thing, even if it might feel judgmental. It's like it's for the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it can be useful thinking about. I like the example of thinking about your own life. How would I judge my life if I behave this way or this other way? And I think another concrete upshot is, of course, the advice Seneca gives us explicitly around deciding what sorts of people you're going to have around you.
Yeah, that's
That
a good one.
involves certainly involves judgment about who's living well and who you can learn from. All right,
It,
we've got one more. No one intends to do evil. This is this view of Socratic intellectualism, it's sometimes called, which is, I think, it's a natural. This is one of the more radical Stoic positions. Again, moving out of the conventional, that the Stoics believed really no one is attempting to do what's evil by their own lights. They're aiming to do their best. They're simply ignorant about the nature of the good. And I think there's one quote they make explicit reference to from Plato, which is a Socratic idea, which is that every soul is deprived of the truth against its will. This idea that people are aiming to act according to what is good by their lights, but often have mistaken views about the nature of the good, and as such, do evil, not because they have some pure sort of base desire to do evil, but because they're mistaken about the nature of the good life.
yeah, this is because you titled this politically incorrect, and so I'm thinking, whose politics? And it's funny how we're kind of jumping back between right wing and left wing. So the idea that some lives are better than others, maybe that's more politically incorrect to people on the left. Same with this idea that like you've got certain obligations to family, which are just like special and there's nothing you can do about it. But then this is something that maybe is more politically incorrect to the right, who like really focuses, I think, on moral responsibility and is okay with concepts of like the death penalty as, or more in favor of ideas like the death penalty for justice or like punishment because you're like a bad person who's run to the core. You killed these children. You should just die, right? You deserve it. And so this is almost like pushing back against that. It's this idea that, as you said, we're all deprived of the truth unwillingly. People want it connects to the previous point, right? People want to live good lives. Some lives are better than others. People want to live good lives. It's like the Stoics would say it's psychologically necessary. That's the Socratic intellectualism part, is that it's like it's impossible to intentionally try to make your life worse because as a rational being, you're just this thing going about selecting the preferred thing in each situation. So you can't make your life holistically worse. It's like psychologically not possible to make that choice. So anybody who is living a bad life is ignorant. They're mistaken. They have a distorted picture of reality. And I think it's really profound. It's helpful for yourself, for forgiving yourself, understanding the nature of moral progress. It's helpful for moving away from this picture of like original sin or some sort of like inherent flaw in us. The flaw we have is ignorance, and that's one that the Stoics think we can overcome. So I love this idea. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the one that's most difficult to internalize. I suppose it's exceptionally difficult never to experience anger, but at least it's an intellectual matter. I think this one's more difficult for me to internalize to the extent that those can be distinguished. But I do think it's an interesting point to think of this as more left wing. It's a common pattern to perhaps look at less than desirable behavior or problematic behavior and point to, someone made a mistake. It's because of their previous experiences, their social position, or they just acted under false information or something like that. So perhaps that's a more common left-wing type move. And I think certainly that can have, you can do that poorly. You can excuse or deny someone's agency, but fundamentally that move is correct for the Stoics. The idea that, they're not intrinsically evil. Even the worst people you can imagine, they're mistaken.
Yeah, it's like that, and then you add a but to it. It's like you're evil because of your circumstances, your beliefs, your upbringing, the systemic factors that made you put you where you are. But it's up to you to fix that, to improve that, to change that. So it's like this recognition of the circumstances that have led there. It's like you're not flawed because of you, but you're only going to get better because of you. Or you can only look to yourself to get better. And so it's like that nice mix of acknowledging circumstance while still having personal accountability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think all of these there's a sort of pattern of at once sort of acknowledging that much of the external is in a way irrelevant, but you're still coming back to the internal, your ability to have agency and such, without, in this case, having an evil soul or some desire that's purely bent on pursuing something that's bad, can't be changed.
Yep, good point.
Awesome. Well, summing up then, these 7 controversial ideas from Stoicism. There's probably some more, but I think we hit on some of the main ones. First, politics can't be an obstacle to your happiness. Second, anger is never appropriate. Third, neither victimhood nor victory is a moral credential or a trump card. Fourth, you don't get to choose all of your roles. You have natural roles that are not voluntary. Fifth, nearly everyone today lives in luxury. I think especially our listeners and such, people who interact with our content generally come from the developed world. Sixth, some lives are better than others. And seven, no one intends to do evil.
Yeah, great list.
Awesome. Let us know what you think. And thanks for listening.